My first ever narration of a little flip lesson going on. I'm going to take the time to do a quick review of important differences between your central and your peripheral nervous system. So we'll start there. Okay, so we've got major divisions: central, peripheral, brain, spinal cord, everything else. Afferent are sensory neurons taking stimuli to the central nervous system. Efferent carries away. We're going to look at the difference between autonomic, which means automatic, you don't have to think about it, versus anything that's motor controlled, which is voluntary muscle. And then we'll take a look at the differences between parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. Okay, so let's blow this up. Here's your internal and external stimuli picked up by sensory receptors. And that stimulus is carried by the afferent neurons into the brain and the spinal cord. This is your information processing area. Okay, once that information is processed, then the response is sent via the efferent neurons that are here. Okay, so we have two different divisions that these efferent neurons function in. The autonomic, which is involuntary. So this has a sympathetic division, parasympathetic, and enteric. Enteric means intestinal. This is your digestion, peristalsis, movement of food through your alimentary canal, another word for your digestive system, and then control of smooth muscle, cardiac muscles, and glands. So let's go over that. All right, so here's parasympathetic division, and just keep a note, this is in the medulla right here, right? And so parasympathetic division has targets constricting eye pupils, stimulating salivary gland secretion for when you're ready to digest food, constricting bronchi and lungs, and you can read down and see what it does. Okay, so there's a lot of stimulation here. The sympathetic division takes place lower in the spinal cord. So we'll go into the next screen to see the rest of that. So you have some ganglia, a bunch of neurons put together here. These actions take place near your cervical vertebrae, right, top of your spinal cord. So a dilation of the pupil. So that is the opposite of the constriction, right? It's going to inhibit the salivary gland secretion versus the parasympathetic that's going to stimulate. So what you'll find is that for parasympathetic division, there's a lot of stimulation going on, with the exception of the slowing of the heartbeat over here. There are exceptions. So let's pop down into the sympathetic division. And so for the rest of the spinal cord, here's your thoracic, there's your mid-back, your lumbar, your lower back, relaxation of the bronchi, acceleration of the heart, inhibit activity of the stomach and small intestines, inhibit the activity of the pancreas. Okay, so these are all responses to environmental stimuli. So like, when would this happen? Well, if, like we were talking about with hormonal control, if epinephrine is released, epinephrine will be a hormone that targets cells in the intestines to actually constrict those down, right? So you're going to constrict blood flow to stomach and small intestines, and that is also a function of inhibiting activity of the stomach and intestines so that that energy can be shunted elsewhere and saved and conserved, okay? So if we look at the reflex action really quickly, it doesn't require the brain. Central nervous system processing is not required here because you don't have to think about it, right? So we can test that. Here's your quad muscles. Here's the sensory, the afferent neurons carrying that information into the gray matter of the spinal cord. Quick relay for a quick motor reflexive action here for contraction of the muscles based on that stimulus. So it's fast because reflexes are typically designed to prevent some kind of harm so that you don't have to stop and think about it, right? Maintain homeostasis and keep you alive. All right, so I'm not going to focus too much on some of the brain structure. We went over this the other day. Rainbows are pretty. I'm going to pop into a difference between gray matter and white matter. So white matter is all axons. Gray matter is your cell bodies, your nerve terminals, and your dendrites, which pick up the stimulus. Here are your ventricles in the center, okay? And the ventricles carry cerebral spinal fluid. A lot of nutrients are carried to the brain and spinal cord through there. So let's pop into what we didn't get to really discuss the other day. We looked at development, but we didn't get too much further than this. So let's go over what the brain is doing. Okay, so the medulla and the pons, here it is, here's the pons, here's your medulla just above your spinal cord. This is autonomic nervous system. So you don't have to think about it. It controls all of the involuntary actions, stimulation of heartbeat, right? Control of breathing. So, can you voluntarily control your breathing? Yes, you can think about taking a deep breath and then take a deep breath. But other than that, you don't have to think about breathing during the day. And we spoke about this in class the other day. If you had to think while you were breathing, and then you had to think about your heart beating, and then you had to think about doing peristalsis, you wouldn't be able to do anything. Okay, so the medulla controls all of those involuntary activities. Here's your cerebellum. This is in the hind brain region, the occipital region of the brain, controls balance and coordination. And then the cerebrum, the main yellow portion here, is all of your higher order functions. So what does that mean? So higher order functions are thinking, reasoning, abstract thought, but there's a lot of other stuff that goes on inside your cerebrum as well. So this is considered the prefrontal cortex here. So these are where executive functions take place in the brain. This is your inhibition of automatic responses. This is planning and organization, your working memory. The middle portion of the brain here, kind of down these lines in the cerebrum, is your motor cortex, where you have some control and coordination of voluntary muscle. Now the balance and the coordination of doing all of those muscular actions at once falls to the cerebellum, but the motor cortex is an important area in here as well. Okay, and then in the further reaches of the brain back here, in your hindbrain, you'll have visual center. Okay, so we'll go over some of those other things in a minute. And we spoke about the hemispheres of the brain, right cerebral hemisphere, left cerebral hemisphere. So when you look from a rear view, you can see the cerebellum underneath stretching all the way across. And behind your neck, where I had you feel the other day, you can palpate, or you can touch that little indent underneath your skull, where your spinal cord will actually start. Okay, so here's the hypothalamus, temperature control center of the brain. Hypothalamus is also one of the first neurosecretory organs. So we'll talk about that. But we call this the seat of endocrine control, and we'll focus more on these things in hormonal control in class this week. All right, so here's your different regions. Like I was saying about the motor cortex, here's control of all your skeletal muscle. Here's your prefrontal cortex for your decision making, your planning. So we call this the frontal lobe, right behind your forehead. Here's Broca's area. This is where speech is formed. Temporal lobes, right, side of your temples. Here's your temporal lobe. Auditory cortex. This is hearing. Wernicke's area is where you actually comprehend language. Back here. So in the parietal lobe, a little bit of sense of touch is interpreted in this section of your brain. The integration of all the sensory information takes place here. Here's your visual region of your brain. So I showed you this when we looked at the eye the other day, how the optic nerves actually run from your eyeballs here through your brain, and then what you're seeing is interpreted back here. This is, combination of object recognition. So, when you look at a car, you know it's a car. And this is part of the brain that's doing that. So let's say somebody has a stroke, and they have a stroke in this area of the brain, control of skeletal muscle, and maybe it's the portion of neurons that controls the right arm. Okay, so that would be more on the left side of the brain. And so if there were a bleed on the brain here somewhere and those neurons were destroyed, at first they would not be able to control their right side of the arm. Right? If they had a stroke in the Broca's area, in this place, over here, and the brain tissue is damaged here, forming speech would be difficult. Okay, and that's very different than the Wernicke's area where you're comprehending language. So somebody that has a stroke in Broca's area can comprehend what other people are saying if this brain tissue is fine, but just has trouble articulating the speech. That's how that works. Okay, so a couple of examples of that. All right, so if we look at somatosensory, right, which means your body senses, body cells, and which parts of the brain actually control that, That's what this diagram is for. So if you go inward, these are the somatosensory cortex portion and what it's controlling, right? So leg, hip, trunk, neck, head. So your sensory neurons would carry signals to here. So if you touch your lips, this is a section sort of the brain that's detecting that sense. Okay, motor cortex, a little bit different. The control of the neck and the brows, your thumb, your fingers, your hand, your wrist, your forearm. Okay, so that's the difference between the two. It's always a weird looking diagram. Okay. All right, so let's just compare organisms. If we look at human versus avian brain, the first thing we can do is look at the differences. So we can see all these folds in the human brain. And if we look at the avian brain, this would be to scale, right? Tiny. Okay, but if we blow it up, here it is. And we can compare the hind brain. Here's, hind brain. If we look at the colors, you can see that the midbrain area, a little larger for avians. Thalamus is larger for temperature control. Look at their cerebellum. Check this out. So really large, the balance and coordination center, which makes sense because flight is really difficult and very hard to coordinate. Okay, so some other key differences, of course, if you look at the yellow, right? So here's your outer portion of your cerebral cortex, lots of folds here. So if I go back and look at these sensory areas, right? You can look at the folds and what this is controlling versus a more smooth brain. The way that it works for intelligence is that the more folds you have, typically the more intelligent versus the lefts. Okay, and we can actually see this with Alzheimer's patients that start to lose some of the neuron functioning in their brains. We can take a look at some of that later on. Okay, so let's look at some functions. We can do functional MRI, can show some word-related brain activity. So this is how we know which areas of the brain are controlling what. Okay, so maximum would be red, minimum is purple, so generating words mostly in this kind of prefrontal area, generating words. Seeing words, when you're reading, like showing word-related brain activity, you're using this area of your brain for the most part. Hearing words, so we can tell where the auditory center is, and then speaking words, right up in that Broca's area. Okay, and then the amygdala, this is the emotional seat of the brain. So we can look at what happens when you listen to music. So when you listen to sad music, the amygdala is what lights up, different emotional stimulus there, versus happy music that excites other areas of the brain when they light up. And then we can also look at low frequency waves, the characteristics of sleep, right, versus high frequency when you're awake. So when we look at brain waves, if you're seeing this times 0 hours times 1 hour, right, here's your right hemisphere, they're opposite. So this would be for dolphins. This would be dolphins sleeping one hemisphere at a time. That's pretty cool. All right, so brain damage. Actually, no, let me back up here. Let's see if I can make that a little bit larger. Here we go. All right, so it's hard to predict some of the effects that will have on an individual, and part of that is because of what we were talking about the other day, where there's, there's different pathways for neurons to send messages through the brain. But we can take a look at certain things, like the famous story of Phineas Gage. So he had a railroad spike in an accident driven through his brain, and it went right through his prefrontal cortex. So he actually lived for 12 years after this was removed, and his personality changed. So from this we learned, especially like emotional and the whole personality, that that was controlled by the frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex here. If we look at Alzheimer's and its destruction, we really look at these amyloid plaques that form and some of these tangles. And so these plaques are disrupting the neuron function there. And depending on where the plaques originate can affect that area of the brain, and a lot of that has to do with memory. And then as for neuroplasticity, evidence of new neural stem cells in a mouse that are actually growing So that's the hippocampus region of the brain, more of the midbrain area for that. Okay, ta-da, there's some of the plaques and beautiful neurogenesis. All right, so here's what I want to get to, a little bit of response. So how do animals respond? And for animals, it's all about the muscle. So we'll do a little bit about the different kinds of muscle and a little bit on sliding filament theory. Okay, so skeletal muscle is for voluntary motion. Skeletal muscle is striated muscle. So it looks like stripes of fibers. I'll blow up the picture in a minute. Smooth muscle, these are your organs, right? So if you feel the inside of your cheek with your tongue, that's smooth muscle. Cardiac muscle, independent. So cardiac muscle can contract independently of everything else. And which part of the brain controls that? Medulla. Okay, so that's cardiac muscle. Skeletal muscle is under conscious control. So this is your motor control. Let me go back. I just want you to take a look at this cool looking skeletal muscle and how striated that is. Okay, so you can see the different fibers that are here. Right? We're not going to go too much into the anatomy of that, not as important. All right, so muscle cells do two things. They contract, that's a concentric contraction, or they relax. Eccentric means they lengthen, that's it. And so the way that this works is that they slide over each other. It's part of sliding filament theory. And I showed you that in class, kind of sliding my forearms over each other to contract the muscle. So you have antagonistic pairs of muscles, right? So your biceps will be your flexors, right? When you contract your arm up, they're going to shorten. And then your extensors to straighten your arm back out are going to be your triceps. Okay, so we can compare this with other organisms. We look at the grasshopper, and you can see where its extensor muscles and its flexor muscles are, right? A little bit different. And that's part of the reason why they can jump so high. Okay, so muscle structure, the typical muscle structure, you have a bundle of fibers, right? So here's all the different fibers in the bundle. And there's nucleus, right? You have nuclei here. And then we can pull out one of those fibers and we can see the myofibrils in it, right? And then we have what we call these Z lines here. So this is called one sarcomere, okay? So the way that this works is when you contract the muscle within these sarcomeres, these lines are going to overlap each other, these Z lines. Okay, so each muscle is a bundle of muscle fibers, and then each fiber has a bunch of multinucleated cells, and then each cell is a collection of myofibrils, and it's packed with actin and myosin filaments, and those are arranged in sarcomeres. So I don't want you to spend too much time on this. It's a little bit of understanding. The biggest thing that I want you to get out of muscle structure is that these muscles are innervated by motor neurons. So a motor neuron, terminal branches, can innervate several different bundles of muscle fibers at once to help with contraction. That's the most important thing. Okay, so there we go. There's some striated skeletal muscle. Right, and if we look at the function, here's the sliding filament model, so I'll blow this up a little bit. Okay, energy required to contract muscles, right? So here's your ATP. So in diagram 1, here's your myosin head, low energy configuration, right? Spread out. And then we have some binding sites here. Here's your actin. So ATP can help to cause this contraction. Here's your high energy configuration here. And this is going to cause these thin filaments to move towards the centers of those sarcomeres, where those Z lines were, right? So when we come over to the right, just a little explanation. ATP is hydrolyzed, right? So hydrolysis of ATP, adding water to break things apart. So when we say hydrolyzed, ATP broken down into ADP plus PI to move myosin between the active high energy and inactive low energy conformations. So you're doing conformational change of protein here, but we're just talking about with muscle fibers. Okay, so myosin's going to bond to the actin, got a little cross bridge, it pulls it to the middle, and that causes that shortening so that the filaments slide over each other. Okay, actin and myosin sliding past each other is what sliding filament theory is. Ta-da! Okay, so in order to do that, calcium has to be present. You need those calcium ions. They must be present in the sarcomere and bonded to tropomyosin for myosin to actually bond to actin. Okay, so calcium is stored in the sarcomere in a place called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Calcium has lots of different functions, and as we were looking at with neurotransmitters being released from terminal branches, calcium actually has to come in order for neurotransmitters to be released from vesicles at terminal end branches and neurons, by the way. So calcium is a really important intermediate mineral to help us do those things. Okay, so nervous system interfaces with muscle at neuromuscular junctions. And here's where acetylcholine is really important. So it's a neurotransmitter, and it's responsible for that calcium ion release into the sarcomere, right? So motor neurons terminate at these neuromuscular junctions. So you can see the axon of the motor neuron. Here's your synaptic terminal, right? And so your motor neuron is going to stimulate, several tubules of the myofibrils, right? So that the muscle can contract. Actually, we can blow this up and see it right there. Okay, so here's the synaptic end. Okay, and we can see the calcium pump for that. Okay, that's going to cause through the sarcoplasmic reticulum's little space that's in there to help these myofibrils contract and slide over each other. That's about it. All right, so I'm going to move on from there. If we look at total muscle contraction, tetanus, only initiated when enough motor units are activated. This is a twitch summation. Okay, so we have action potential. Here's a single twitch of the muscle, right? Here's two twitches, so you can see the pair of action potentials that are here. Okay, and if you take a series of those action potentials at high frequency for muscle contraction, eventually you can get tetanus. So tighten up your muscle and hold it in that isometric contraction. Okay, that's what's going on there. And that means if the tension is increasing here, then the contraction is increasing while you're holding it. Okay, and keep in mind, action potentials are traveling down the axon, right? So if I come back here and I take a look at what's happening, here's the neurotransmitter release. To do that, you require calcium in order for actin and myosin to be activated and slide over each other. All right, let's go back. Okay, those twitches, or for the muscle contraction, that tension that it's increasing over time, to hold that means that the motor units are activated and they're constantly sending a signal. So when your motor cortex in your brain is stimulating you to contract your bicep muscle and hold that contraction, or if anybody's ever made you do a wall squat, you got to sit there for a minute. Your brain is sending that signal to hold your glutes and your quads and everything working to keep you in that position to hold your body weight. You're in tetanus at that point. All right? So an involuntary tetanus is not a good thing, right? So if it's involuntary and your muscles are contracted with stonefish venom, that can be dangerous. All right, so human skeleton is an endoskeleton because it's within your body. Exoskeletons are found on arthropods. Means the skeleton is on the outside, which is made of chitin. Okay, so for humans, it's all about the bone tissue. And during the early part of your life, your bones grow at a very rapid rate, right? So bone cells are doing mitosis fairly rapidly during different growth spurts. Unless girls, you're probably pretty much done, but guys, you'll continue that growth spurt up to the age of 25 before you level out. So bones are awesome. Living bone, constantly broken down and reformed by populations of bone stem cells. And just remember, the marrow is the site of blood cell production, and your joints are your connections between your bones. Okay, so we can see that here's your shoulder joint. This is a ball and socket joint. So ball and socket joint means you can do a 360 rotation. Your hinge joints are like your humerus. You can only go in one way. Like you straighten your arm out and you can bend it. Okay, the knee is also a hinge joint, right? Like you can extend your knee and then you can flex it and bring your heel back to your butt. The pivot joint is your radius and your ulna. So if you put your hand over your forearm and then you turn your thumb up and then you bring it back and turn your palm down, you can feel that pivot, the ulna and the radius pivoting over the top of each other. Okay. All right, so other skeletons. So all vertebrates, anything that's a vertebrate that has a backbone has an endoskeleton, right? Like here's the snake. So the advantage or that with it being internal, it grows with the organisms. You don't have to worry about molting like you'll see within an exoskeleton. Okay, so that, if it's not growing with the organism, then it has to be periodically shed, like crabs. Okay, so exoskeletons in sea creatures would be the shell. Here's snake skeleton. Okay, these are exoskeletons made of chitin. And there's calcium carbonate, which makes up most shells. And we can take a look at molting, if it works. Oh, yes. Here we go. If you've never been to the Atlantis Aquarium, you can see the giant king crabs there. Now, of course, this one's in a tank. And if you watch, if you take note here, he's shedding that outer layer of his exoskeleton. It's coming off. That's what's called molting. All right, so I'm just going to speed that up. If you want to watch it on your own, you can. Well, maybe I sped it up too fast. Let's go back. Yeah, look. There's the old skeleton. Okay? All right. All right, so annelids. They have hydrostatic skeletons. These are worms. So no bones. Squishy. It's all about internal pressure. And then if we look at movement, animals have 3 options. So it's going to be flying, running, or swimming. Sometimes you can do, well, not too many can do all 3. That's pretty specific. It'd be awesome if humans could fly, though. Okay, so there's energy considerations to this. Of course, flying is going to cost the most energy. Here's running, swimming the least. You're supported by the water. That's why. And that's it. Okay, so make sure that you understand some of the sensory information in the beginning. We went over in that class the other day. Be able to explain the major divisions of the nervous system: autonomic, sympathetic, parasympathetic. Explain the relationships between the divisions of the human brain. So that's cerebrum, cerebellum, medulla. Try to explain a cause of nervous system disruption and disruptions of the nervous system, how they can lead to disruptions of homeostasis. How the skeletal muscular system functions at a system and a cellular level, but I want you to concentrate on how the nervous system is innervating those muscles and making them contract. We went over sliding filament theory, and then any cause of sensory or motor system disruption and how those disruptions can affect homeostasis. All right, so thanks. I hope that was helpful.